Welcome back to our second session. And in this session, we're going to think about how we can embed dementia research into our clinical practice. I think we know for sure that patients receive better care when they are seen in a research active service. And we know it absolutely makes sense that we're never going to have treatments unless we do research. But I think I'm going to guess that most patients who have contacts with NHS services do not hear about research. And so what we wanted to do was to have a discussion that included people who have really successfully delivered research or taken part in research to try and think about what best practice is with regards to integrating dementia research into clinical practice. Okay, so I'm going to start first of all by introducing Dr Vanessa Raymont, who's an old age psychiatrist in Oxford, who I know very well. It's a pleasure to work with Vanessa. She's R&D Director and Associate Director of Dementia Platform UK. So if you want to come up and give your 5-minute talk, and then we'll go through the other speakers. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Liz, for that introduction. And I mean, we've been hearing a lot of things this morning about the fact that we need innovation, we need research in order to ultimately deliver those more accurate, earlier diagnoses that we're going to need for disease-modifying drugs. And I would also add, given the fact that we know an awful lot more about risk reduction and potential management as well, so we're in a very different place than we were 20 or 30 years ago with management of diseases that lead to dementia. But we've also heard that we have a problem with data and getting accurate data, and it was highlighted as well that the UK does not have the best data set. And so I'm going to talk about a network of sites that I think can provide an answer to that in terms of establishing a cohort of real-world data for both service development and to improve trials, because again, we're hearing the fact that disease-modifying drugs have come a long way, but there's obviously a lot more work to do in terms of research to deliver yet more. So again, this just emphasizes what other people have said. Disease-modifying drugs have been on the agenda for a long time, and thank goodness it looks like they're possibly here. But the reality is that in our memory clinics, we do much the same as we did 20 or 30 years ago. And that's starting to limit both access for new treatments for patients, but also, as I said, data in order to enhance service development and feed into trials. And I hope most of the people who are leading these clinics are here, actually. So I hope they don't mind the fact that I've used their name on my slide. But this is a network of brain health clinics that are developing across the UK. These are very much just led by individual consultants or clinical researchers. So they're all very different models. But what they're creating is a network of sites that will give us real-world NHS data that we can use to develop these services we need to deliver these new drugs. And I'm going to tell you just slightly about what's happening in Oxford. My colleague Claire Mackay is going to give you a little more detail later today. But what we've developed in Oxford is a pilot that's been running for 2 years where we have an integrated clinical and research service. And the purpose for this is to trial out some of these new assessments and see, do they actually work in a clinical pathway? This is not about setting up a research clinic. This is about bringing research and embedding it into the service. Again, as we've been hearing, is becoming increasingly important for very, very good reason. And in terms of what that does for research opportunities, well, first of all, it means you can actually target people efficiently into trials. One of the big problems we know we have in clinical trials is the fact that we have a really heterogeneous population that we actually don't characterize very well before we put them into trials. If we're starting to collect more sophisticated biomarkers, cognitive imaging assessments, we can use that to stratify people in trials. We can evaluate biomarkers, whether that be imaging or blood biomarkers or anything else. And maybe, again, we've heard a lot about imaging and the opportunities that that gives us for earlier and more accurate diagnosis, but we've got to find a way to trial some of those protocols in agile services that can then feed into the commission services at scale. And so this is just one example of what's happening in Oxford. We've been able to compare our MRI scan data with UK Biobank data, and the red dots at the bottom of the slide are actual patient scans. What you can see from this is we're already able to identify outliers. This is based on a standardized MRI with a short research protocol at the end, gives us a little bit more quantitative data about hippocampal volume. It's already proving useful in a clinical population. And we've already been able to show that this type of scanning improves confidence in diagnosis. But what does this do for research? The other thing I wanted to talk very briefly about is the Dementia Platform's UK Trial Delivery Framework. So for people who don't know, DEPA UK is funded by the MRC and industry funding. It's been funded for 5 years and renewed about a year ago. And as part of that, we are developing a network of sites that for both recruitment and trial delivery. And again, this is about that well-characterized patient group and saying, is there a way of integrating that characterization in clinical services? Because that will deliver those representative real-world populations that we don't get in trials at the moment. Also, as part of this framework, we're hoping to develop a network of sites that will be able to deliver trials really efficiently and align it very much with the needs of industry as they're developing new drugs. And we've already got preclinical registers. These have been running for 5 years. Basically, they're incorporated from existing cohorts. And as you can see, we've got about 65,000 people now within our preclinical registers and a wealth of health, cognitive, and genetic data already. And what we're doing that's really new at this point is starting to bring in clinical sites. So we create a cohort of people with prodromal disease, early dementia. We've actually got 15 sites as of this week signed up, which is great. And we're liaising with other networks internationally. So there's Global Alzheimer's Platform in the US, Brain Health Scotland, JDR and others. And we're really working on, can we utilize the power of this brain health clinic network to get a really useful common data set, both for service development and to integrate into trials? Can we think of some kind of way of standardizing things like contracts and costs so we make trial delivery more efficient? So that's our aim. Hopefully this is one way that we can embed research more effectively into clinical services. So thank you very much.
So next we have Professor Roy Jones, who is president of the Royal United Hospital Rice Clinic, and he's been there every step of the way in the development of disease-modifying therapies for Alzheimer's disease. This now contributes to the boards of several of these trials and also to NICE. So thanks very much, Roy.
Okay, thanks. Well, I have the distinction of being the most experienced clinical trialist in dementia, certainly in the UK, and possibly one of the most experienced in the world, because I've actually been doing clinical trials in this area since 1987, before some of you were probably actually born. And I'm going to talk about the opportunities for research in clinical practice, not necessarily in specialist centres. I published a paper in 2010, which is based on a study in Europe, 5 countries, including the UK, which talked to 250 carers and 500 physicians. And what this paper, you don't need to be able to read any of it, it's there just to illustrate, but what this paper showed is that physicians and caregivers were not that aware of research opportunities. But when asked if they were prepared to help recruitment for studies or to take part in studies, nearly all of them were. So that the opportunity is there for many more patients to get involved in studies. And the first way of doing that is to follow what was mentioned right at the beginning. You should make research a part of your culture. It should be part of every clinic culture. Not always easy, and we'll talk a bit more about that. This is how we operate our system. My memory clinic started in 1987. We have therapy groups for our patients. We have carers courses. We carry out research, all based on our memory clinic, which is the memory clinic for the Bath and North East Somerset area. And as you see, I'm very pleased, since I've retired now more or less from clinical activity routinely, that we got an outstanding CQC rating last year, including outstandingly well managed. So I thought it was a good time for me to retire. So we integrate it all within that. What work do we do? Well, we do a lot of clinical trials working with pharmaceutical companies with new and existing drugs. We've studied more than 50 drugs. All of the drugs that have been launched and licensed in the world, including aducanumab, have been tested in our centre. But we also do clinical research to look at non-drug and other treatment approaches. We're involved in some academic projects looking at better ways to assess, diagnose and monitor memory problems. And also we're looking at the impact of dementia and related conditions on the person affected and their loved ones. And that particularly is a study called IDEAL, which some of you may be centres for, based in Exeter, which has been going on now for about 5 years. Really interesting study that's been talking to a lot of patients with dementia and their families and generating a huge amount of interesting data. And that's possible within the setup. So I've said you should make involvement in research in your culture, but I realise that quite a lot of you probably are what you would call jobbing old age psychiatrists or jobbing clinicians generally. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing is every patient attending our memory clinic, virtually since we started, is offered the chance to join our research register. It's a letter, basically a sheet of paper that they sign if they would like to be involved potentially in research. Doesn't commit them to anything, but says are they interested. I think in the 25, 30, it's more than that now, 37 years I've been there, gosh, that's a long time. 35 years with the clinic, I think we've only had a handful of people who've actually said, no, I don't want to go on that list. Now, whether they're suitable for the studies and whatever, it depends what studies you're talking about. But nevertheless, most people will say they're prepared to be interested. And they're keen to be involved for themselves, and as Nick said, not just for themselves, but for the benefit to other people. It's amazing how they will accept that they may not be helping their own condition because the results are going to take too long, but for their children, their families, other people. And the other thing is to maintain contact with the clinic team, which they enjoy. Now, I know in a lot of centres, mild cognitive impairment is a diagnosis, if you make it, where you discharge patients. But if they're able to get involved in any of these very early Alzheimer's studies, you can keep them involved. And that is another reason why quite a lot of those people are keen to be involved, because it keeps the contact. In our setup, and it's not always the case with this, we always link the memory clinic and the research clinics. The memory clinic operates separately. We're not doing research in the clinic. It's a proper clinic, but the team are the same. And my team have always said that they enjoy this. They enjoy the involvement in research and the involvement in the clinic. They know the patients better, so when the patients from our clinic start to take part in studies, they're much better understood. They know us, they know the setup, etc., and it's helpful. Select studies carefully. If you are going to do them yourselves, don't be over-ambitious. Don't try and do 3 immunological studies with IV infusions, etc. You will struggle to find the patients. So look carefully at what disease you're looking at, what patients you're looking at, and start small if you're going to start yourselves. But if you, and the other way of recruiting is, and you'll see information about this outside, consider recruiting from Joint Dementia Research, which is proving to be a lot more helpful than we perhaps originally expected. We're beginning to get more patients through that route, and you can find more about that. These are patients not necessarily from your own clinic. And finally, if you actually don't think you can do it yourself, you can become a PIC site, a patient identification centre. That can be primary care or hospitals where you actually you make contact with researchers like me, and we can recruit patients from your clinic. Obviously, there are geographical issues about that, but this is a way where your team can get involved in research without necessarily doing it directly yourself. Thank you very much.
Yes, so next we have Dr. Emer MacSweeney. So does anybody know for sure how the NHS will be funded in 20, 30 years' time? And do we really know how other people work? So I think sometimes we wonder how, as neurologists or care of the elderly physicians, old age psychiatry work and vice versa. But there are whole different ways of working. And Emer runs a really successful research recruitment company in the commercial sector. So I thought it'd be great to hear from Emer about how that works.
Thank you. So my company is Recognition Health, and just by brief background, we started Recognition Health in 2011, and we set it up really with a vision and a mission to provide the best possible early, accurate diagnosis and appropriate treatment for patients with progressive cognitive impairment and neurodegenerative diseases. And at that time, it was very much focused on Alzheimer's disease because that was the one for which there was most demand. So today we have 8 locations, 6 in the UK. We have a centre which has been very successful in Washington for a few years. We're actually opening Houston in about 1 week's time, and then we'll be opening a centre in Chicago by March of next year, and another one in the US next year as well, plus some more in the UK. But I will explain in a minute why we're starting to focus on the US. Even though we are very passionate about providing the opportunity for people to join clinical trials in the UK. We are brain and mind experts, and we don't just work in clinical trials. We also provide expert medico-legal reports for traumatic brain injury, and we've been involved in a lot of the very high the high court cases that have been taking place recently with a lot of high profile. We're also very involved in chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and we also have private patients. The three areas that we focus on are neurodevelopment, and we do clinical trials in autism, ADHD, etc., traumatic brain injury, and neurodegenerative diseases. So with that background, obviously the opportunities that we're involved in research in clinical practice in the UK involve several different areas. We do a lot of interventional clinical trials, phase 1B to phase 3, for Alzheimer's, MS, Parkinson's, and other CNS diseases. And within that category, we're screening, or we have at least over 1,000 patients a month contacting us, desperate to get into clinical trials. So there are plenty of patients out there, or plenty of people out there, who want to get into these clinical trials. And one comment I would make, which I think lines up with what Roy was saying, is the most common comment from our patients is, I wish I had known about this earlier. So people are so keen to get into studies. We also collaborate with some academic partners. Much of this is in the development of imaging biomarkers, and it has been more focused on chronic traumatic encephalopathy than in AD. We do provide, as Recognition Health, we provide funding for research and development. And we also work in some de novo technology clinical trials, often with some sort of like smaller groups that are bringing new methodology for early diagnosis using quite clever techniques, particularly for Alzheimer's. And then we are also actually involved in an early access program where we have patients with Alzheimer's, frontotemporal dementia, and the very first patients in the world with chronic traumatic encephalopathy. We have actually recently done the GCSA, that's the Global Clinical Trials Accreditation, and the first centres or first company in the UK to be qualified in all domains. And I mention this really because I think it is important for UK clinical trials, particularly for the commercial clinical trials, to become increasingly competitive, because it's not a case of NHS is competing against the private sector. This is very much UK competing against the rest of the world. And I have to confess, one of the reasons that we are focusing now in opening new centres in the US is because currently, of the 420 trials in the pipeline for Alzheimer's in the US, and this is on clinicaltrials.gov, you can check it, this is in October, only 38 are being considered for the UK. So less than 10% of the trials that are opening in the US are available to open in the UK. And that's due to a number of different things. It wasn't helped by Brexit and all the problems with bringing drugs and isotopes, etc., into the UK. But it is also, and I don't know if there's anyone here from MHRA, but it is also the length of time for setup. So in the US, our average length of time to set up from first contact to setting up is about 2 to 3 months. In the UK, it's currently running at about 18 months. And we have the same management system and exactly the same team at an operational and a corporate level that are doing the contracting and the feasibility and the setup of the studies. So I'd like to, the message I think I really want to give is we need to be so much more competitive in the UK in order to get more trials, to recruit more patients onto these studies, and to be able to do it more quickly. We have studies in our US centre that open often 9 or 10 months before the same study opens in the UK. And by the time it opens in the UK, we've already recruited lots of people in the US, and we have a short amount of time left in the UK to recruit patients. Thank you.
Okay, now we're very pleased to have Carli Pirie, who's going to give a personal experience. Carli has family members with Alzheimer's disease and has herself 50% chance of inheriting a gene that may cause Alzheimer's. So we're really grateful to you today for coming to talk to us. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. So a little backstory. As a child, I thought it was really odd the way my nan behaved. Heard the word a lot, Alzheimer's here, Alzheimer's there, didn't really understand it as I was a child. When I was 16, my nan passed away, and we just all carried on our lives as normal. I went on to have my own daughter. And then my mum started showing signs of, she was forgetting things, she was phoning me and asking me where her phone was, even though she was on her phone. So I spoke to my granddad and I said, like, something's not right with Mum, she's not remembering things. And he said, right, well, Nanny was at the Dementia Research Centre helping with some research stuff. I'll contact them and I'll see what they can do. So we arranged a meeting, Mum went there, and then we found out that Mum also had Alzheimer's disease, and so did my auntie and so did my uncle. They all were positive for the genetic mutation. Mum was already obviously a symptomatic stage, and it was quite hard to take in for me because obviously we had a child, we didn't realise it was a genetic form. So I didn't cope with it the first couple of years, and then I don't know what happened inside me. I think it was looking at my daughter and thinking, I need to do something about this. I need to know that I've done everything that I can to help with this. So I then had my first meeting at the Dementia Research Centre to get involved in some research, and so on and so forth. 8 or 9 years down the line, a few trials later, I'm here. And I've managed to, along the way, get some family members involved, I think about 5 now. I've raised lots of money for Alzheimer's Research UK, raised lots of awareness for it, because I feel like everything is in the research. That's where everything needs to go, and I know that it gave me a sense of empowerment being involved in research. Weirdly, like a home from home and an additional family, and I think everyone has bad views on getting involved in clinical trials because they think they're going to be like a mouse in a ball running around with things stuck on their heads, whereas you're not. It kind of gives you, it lets you know that you've done everything you can in case, and I think I can look my daughter in the eye if I have got the genetic mutation to say that I helped as much as I could. So that's me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks so much to all 4 of our speakers. Thank you. So now we're going to open up to discussion and we're going to take questions. The first question to Vanessa, really, about the brain health clinics. So any guidance that can be given to people like the idea of setting this up? This question comes from Dr. Nagy.
Yeah, just get started, I think, really. I think the one thing to emphasize is that all of the sites I showed on my map all have very, very different models. Some of them have used research funding. Some of them have started a development off a traditional clinic that they're running. Others have just said, you know, I'm one clinician. I want to try and do something differently. You know, I recognize assessments need to change. I'm going to trial something myself. I think the strength is that we've ended up with a really informal group of people, and as I said, it means we're collecting, in effect, we formed a cohort which we can utilize in terms of data, in terms of evidence for service development for commissioners, all of that kind of thing. But I think, you know, just get started, speak to one of the sites that already has a service up and running. I think we're all really happy to share our models, our ethics if we've needed that. I'll shamelessly plug and say the Oxford Brain Health Centre has a stand outside, so do go and visit it, and we can share information, certainly.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so now a question from Natalie Rowe as well to Emer. So recognition health. So when we're doing trials in people with pre-symptomatic Alzheimer's disease, it can be a real challenge to find those patients. And what have you done to try and improve recruitment in that particular population?
So first you say we are inundated with people in that category. But obviously most of these people aren't in hospitals. They're out in the community. So we do a lot of advertising. We do radio advertising, social media, like all aspects of social media. We do actually have a huge database ourselves of people who are constantly contacting Recognition Health to find out, could there be studies? Are there studies? And actually just a lot of information seeking. So we do webinars and lots of presentations. And I don't know, we just have loads of people who are in this situation and want to know how they can, how they can get onto trials, or how they can, screen for the. We've got the Skyline study in our Birmingham centre at the moment, and we're just literally inundated with people.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Thanks. Okay, so now we've got two things for Carli. That's okay. The first is a comment, and I think we'd all like to echo this. Just thank you so much. That is so illuminating. Thank you very much so maybe we could just give you an extra round of applause saying thank you for coming. Thank you. And the next is a more nuts and bolts question. So you must have done lots of different tests. So which ones are sort of better or worse than you expected?
I would rather a lumbar puncture than do cognitive and memory testing. Even when I do get a spinal headache, I would still rather it than those.
Okay, so that's a tribute to whoever's giving you your lumbar punctures, I think, and maybe it's something about the cognitive tests. So just to follow up on that, in terms of cognitive tests, you must have done the ones where you're face-to-face with somebody and put some on an app and things. Is there a way to make it better?
So currently I'm on the cognitive running for the primary prevention, and I do a lot on the app, that's actually fine. That's not too bad. It's the face-to-face when, although you're not being tested, you can't help but feel that you are being tested. And for some reason, I'm not very good at counting backwards.
Yeah. Well, why would anybody be good at doing that? Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks very much.
I think, though, Liz, it's really interesting that Carli says that a lumbar puncture is less traumatic, bearing in mind that most psychiatrists, particularly, are very nervous about the concept of lumbar punctures. And what I would also say is, Carli's a young person. She's more likely to get post-lumbar puncture headache than our older patients who have a bit more space. So that's really good news to know that lumbar puncture isn't perhaps as traumatic, particularly when it's done well.
Yes, thank you. So I think that's an important point. We've got really small needles now, and we've got a nurse specialist with an ultrasound machine who can do it better than I ever could, certainly, and certainly better than I could now. Right, so a question from John Paul Taylor. So this is an open question to any of the panel. Despite the challenges of the COVID situation, the UK demonstrated significant agility in terms of trialling COVID interventions and supporting important studies exploring the impact of the disease. What do you think we can learn from that? Give you a few seconds to think.
So
yeah.
Can you just repeat what?
So during COVID, we were amazing, I think, as a country. We set up all these trials really quickly.
The COVID trials.
The COVID trials, yes. What can we learn from that in terms of dementia?
I can tell you what we learned. We nearly went bust because the dementia trials weren't going ahead, so we started doing COVID trials. So that's one way. I mean, I think the whole COVID story is madness if you think about it. They managed to get a vaccination in a few months, and we've spent 20 years trying to get an immunisation. So it does show. I don't think the two diseases are the same thing, but I think Emer's point is a genuine one, that the time factor for getting studies, that it was pushed through because everybody was so desperate to give authorisation through the whole process. And I think if the UK could learn from that about trying to shorten the time between putting in a protocol and getting it into a point where you can do the study, that would be probably the most useful benefit, I think.
The regulatory approvals, I agree, especially what we've heard from Emer today about the US.
Yeah. I mean, the FDA and the MHRA are poles apart. I think their effectiveness is in terms of regulation of trials and everything. I mean, I can't really comment on it, but I've been through FDA inspections and I've been through MHRA inspections, and I would say they're pretty similar. But yeah, I mean, the length of time is just extraordinary.
So just, yes, sorry, Karen, yes.
I was going to say, I mean, I would just echo that as well. And I worked in trials in the US for 8 years, and the setup is a very different kind of process. I think the regulatory is certainly one aspect, and what that looks like, as you said, particularly post-Brexit and all those other considerations. I think the other big factor is about, we have a lot of amazing infrastructure in the UK, but I'm not actually sure it works terribly effectively together. And I think that's one key thing. And I think, one of the things we just talked about, for instance, was lumbar punctures. And, we all know, I think, as trialists, that that's often one of the key investigations needed, at least at the moment, in clinical trials. But actually trying to get staff who are trained to do those lumbar punctures is like finding the Holy Grail. And I don't understand why we're not thinking about how we network resources like that, network training, etc. And I think that's the kind of thing that the Dementia Mission, none of us have talked about that, but that was announced about a month ago by government, is trying to develop. How do we work more strongly as a network? And I think that's actually a really key thing. And we're all trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to get to the same goal, which is better treatments. We need to work together more effectively.
Emer's coming back on that.
I was only going to add, like, lumbar puncture as an example. I mean, I do agree with you, but I do think there's also a sort of like making really simple things complicated, in so much that we do loads of lumbar punctures. We use the fine Sprott needle. I don't think in the last, 1,000 we've had a single headache. They literally take about 8 minutes, and the patients have their lumbar puncture. They don't lie down afterwards. They just carry on. Most of them consider it not dissimilar from having a blood test. It's so simple. I literally don't know what the fuss is about.
The fuss is about the fact that we have psychiatrists who can't even see their brain scans, let alone do lumbar punctures. So, I mean, that's one of the issues. But I think the other thing is we do lumbar punctures in our research studies, but trying to get them done for our routine patients and getting amyloid and tau measured, we have to set up special arrangements with Queen Square or Oxford or whatever. We can't just do it routinely, so it's not possible, even though it's in the NICE guideline now, that people should consider lumbar puncture.
So Emer, who does your lumbar punctures?
I do them, and all our doctors do them.
Maybe we should be doing them in the clinic.
Yeah, this is like all our doctors do them.
Yeah.
And when we have new doctors joining us, we have one of those dummy things that we teach doctors on them. And our doctors in the US do them as well. I literally don't know what the problem is.
Okay. No, it's good. It's refreshing to hear it. Got Nick Fox at the back. Yes.
Yeah, we frankly, our clinical nurse specialist is brilliant at doing lumbar punctures. We have a lumbar puncture clinic, but the process of getting her signed off. If you were a doctor, they'd probably say, "Have a go." Oh yeah, now you can do them. But for nurses, it was a really long process. That we should make it more available.
See one, do one, teach one.
Yeah. I mean, for those of us that have done them, it is just pointing a needle in a certain direction and pushing it. I mean, it's not. So yeah, I agree.
I mean, we do have all doctors doing ours.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we have a nurse, but a nurse, I'd say, better. Sorry.
If I could just finish off on that, Liz. I think the other thing, as you said, is it's about the procedures for training staff and the availability of rooms, etc., to do it, but it's also the kind of ethos within the service. And I think, as an old age psychiatrist that's been doing the same thing in clinic since the mid-90s, I think we are at a point where we do have these disease-modifying drugs within reach. Now is the time to look at our services, talk to our clinical colleagues and say, we do need to be doing things differently. And this will be a huge rethink, but it's a massive opportunity. As Chris said at the start, for the first time, we're looking at the possibility of preventing these diseases, and that's just amazing. So we have to think outside the box now, and I don't think we have been for a very long time, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. David Llewellyn's asked a question. This might be tricky to answer, but should research be included in clinical practice, or should clinical practice be more fundamentally embedded in research? Are we thinking about this the wrong way round?
Well, I think we start off seeing patients who need diagnosis and treatment, and that's clinical practice. And we embed research in that. Although, as I say, in our memory clinic, the research is kept separate. So if someone is going into research, it's not taught to them as their first visit to the clinic and whatever. But I think probably it is the right way round that we embed research along with all our other activities, but we still have our fundamental, duty to our patients and their families to do the clinical bit first, as it were, I think.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think that's probably what we have to do as doctors, but is there another way? Maybe there's another model. I can't think what it is.
I think, again, it's about emphasising that the reason we do the clinical processes we do is because of output from research. Our clinical pathways are evidence-based, and I do think we can prioritise that in how we have our discussions with our patients. And I think, ultimately, to be honest, in the population who come through our memory clinics, they are absolutely incredibly keen to get involved in research. So to a certain extent, by not talking about that early enough, we are missing an opportunity for those people to access research and for us to ultimately further the goal of getting treatment.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so
if I can come back briefly, as I was going to say that in our clinic, then you need a diagnosis or some label before people can go into clinical trials. And what I would say is I praise joint dementia research, which does work well, but they are less characterised, and more of those patients fail when they put themselves forward for screening or whatever because they don't fit the criteria. So I think again, the clinical picture first.
But again, I would add to that I think we can solve some of that by solving some of these data issues.
Yes.
You know, we have data on all of those people. It's just joining it up.
Yeah.
So, you know, it comes back again to some of the points that Krish made at the very start. We have that opportunity. It's got to be prioritised.
Thank you. Right, we've got another question for Carli from Nick Fox. So in terms of your family members, what have been the barriers to taking part? And what could we as doctors and researchers do better to try and break down those barriers?
I'll just use my brother as an example. He lives in Australia. So although there's places over there where he can go and get involved, his head is firmly in the sand. He doesn't want to talk about it. I think it's acceptance. But I think the more I talk about it with them, the more they accept it and they understand that actually it will help them. Because I think Nick said that we don't get anything out of it, but we really do get something out of it because we see everything that like you guys are doing, and it gives us that little bit of hope. So I think the biggest barrier, I think, at first was when I was having the lumbar punctures and they were like, we're not doing that. But then they didn't have to have those. They went on and just done the cognitive and memory testing, which now 5 of them are firmly in. So I think that was probably the biggest barrier, was they were worried about the kind of prodding and the poking.
Yeah.
Or just not accepting what's going on around them and that they could potentially have this genetic mutation.
Do you think that one treatment, so I don't know if you heard in the news a couple of weeks ago that one treatment has altered the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease? Potentially, we haven't seen all the data, but do you think that will affect your family members and how they view research? And
Yeah, they might be more keen to get involved because they could see a kind of, probably quite selfishly, that they might be offered that in some way.
I think it does make a difference. Yeah. Okay, and just to finish, so thinking about the future, and this is open to everyone, and I'm not sure if this is good about why we think this is from Dr. Chuliaras. Sorry, I may probably mispronounce that, but why are we talking about lumbar puncture? Next year we're going to be doing blood biomarkers. So is that how we should be thinking about it, or is that actually going to delay research because we haven't actually got the validation behind blood biomarkers? So what do you think?
I mean, I think I would say there's the opportunity to do both. I mean, as we said, the infrastructure to do lumbar punctures at scale across memory clinics is going to be a huge challenge. So the reality is, however validated and reliable those are, most patients are not going to be able to access those. Most clinicians are not going to be able to do those in the next few years. So I think alongside that, given that most memory clinics, we also don't draw blood usually, why not get that infrastructure going alongside certain centres, particularly if they're going to be centres that are going to be potentially delivering disease-modifying drugs very quickly. Obviously, they need to think about expanding their service opportunities for delivering LPs. So I think we need to do both. You know, again, this is about being creative. This isn't, again, I'm going back to Krish's talk, but this is an emergency. You know, this is not looking at one pathway. This is thinking creatively and looking at all of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think Nick made the point that blood biomarkers may well eventually stop the need for amyloid PET, etc. So clearly that's something to look forward to. But there's a lot more hiccups before we get these drugs that need infusions every 2 weeks, MRIs every so often, etc., on the market and available to all the patients. So I think the lumbar puncture or scans might end up being the least. But I think there is a huge issue, and I'm a geriatrician. I should declare that I'm not an old age psychiatrist, but I'm not trying to get at you in this way. But the fact is, the way psychiatry works is not in a position to consider. Neurologists and geriatricians are much more likely to consider and accept lumbar punctures, for example, if necessary. Lots of places won't have access to amyloid PET scans, and so lumbar punctures would be the choice. So I think there are some huge issues. Having said that, we look as if we might be going towards, say, infusion centres, and equally we could go towards lumbar puncture centres as well and get them done that way. So I think there are ways around it, but as you say, old age psychiatry has to have a real rethink if it's going to take on this neurodegenerative disease. It's not a psychiatric disease.
Oh, well, we have to stop there, but I think that's quite a controversial place to stop. Okay, sorry if I missed any questions, and just want to say thank you again to all our 4 speakers. Thank you very much.